So the assignment says we are supposed to assess his arguments and not him, Vine Deloria. I hope I'm saying his name right. I'm going to try really hard to do that. I have my book all sticky noted. The yellow are the things I don't like, and the pink are the things that I will give to him. That's a good way to put it. I'll give it to him. So I decided, let's just go through this little at a time. Won't that be fun? Let's see. In the beginning, he talks about evolution and how we haven't found fossils, any direct lineage to link different species to species of the past and ancestry. And on page 52, he says, "It would be exciting and highly informative to have a list recording every time a scientist has provided a definitive line of human ancestry. We would discover an incredible variety of interpretations that exist and have existed, that new men are almost always relegated to the branches of our species tree and never seem to fall in line as direct ancestors." He even says in other parts of the book that we can't find direct lineages for any species and we can't connect them. And I mean, a lot of them we can connect, and he even says there's no direct lineage for dinosaurs, but I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure birds evolved from dinosaurs. They're very much related. And the fossil record is really incomplete. We know very little about species that were alive in the past. We might know like 2% because so few fossils remain. And of course we're not going to find all of the species that ever existed in the world, so I think it's crazy that he expects us to know like direct lineages and find every single species that occurred in a line. Not to mention evolution, they now believe, can occur really fast. And it doesn't have to take a long time for things to evolve, or like gradual evolution, that sometimes one trait in a species can happen in maybe 2 generations. Evolution can occur completely and change an entire species. So, I don't really agree with that argument at all. The next page I'll talk about is page 82. He's talking about the Salish Indians in their account, and it says, "The first Salish were driven down from the country of big ice mountains where there were strange animals. Fierce people who were not Salish drove them south. So our stories, our people have said, the river of life for us heads in the north." I think that's a pretty good account that he uses from the Native Americans, that they came from the north and the ice, but he does a lot to discredit the land bridge theory and all the northern theories. They didn't have to come from the Bering Strait, but obviously there is Indian accounts of starting in the north. So this use of this Indian story does a good job of proving that Indians came down from the north at some point. Or he doesn't really use the story to discredit any science, I don't think. He proves that little factoid, but he doesn't seem to link his theories to science very well. Or he doesn't link the Indian stories very well sometimes. And he just goes on and on about how he doesn't believe in the land bridge, and then he tells this story about them coming down from the north where the land bridge was. He doesn't really link it to any scientific facts, I don't think, that he's trying to prove. So a lot of the book he's trying to discredit and disprove science. On page 85 he says something that really irritates me. He says, "I can imagine the scene. Bison and Mrs. Bison are peacefully grazing in Central Asia without a care in the world when they look up and see horses, camels strolling by. The camels perhaps on their way to Egypt. Quick as a wink, Bison turns to Mrs. Bison and happily exclaims, 'Honey, do you realize there is an ecological niche for grazing animals now open in Kansas and Nebraska?' The whole herd is terribly excited at the prospect, in spite of the fact that the monsters Bison Tiroli and Bison latrifons already graze most of the Central American plains." That's probably some of the sarcasm you were talking about him using. And while I appreciate good sarcasm, obviously, I think it's stupid what he just wrote. For one thing, they're not conscious animals. They don't make conscious decisions. No. And also, what I would account for this is their animals have a lot of sense for magnetism and direction, and the poles were shifting during this part of the Earth's history, and I think they got confused based on the poles. But I think it's completely ridiculous that he would think the animals made conscious decisions, and because it's not a logical conscious decision for humans to make, he doesn't think animals would make it. Animals and humans have totally different decision-making processes. Not that animals really make decisions, but are more instinctually based. So I find that completely ridiculous that he thinks that's a valid argument. Not to mention that has nothing to do with Native Americans, as many of his arguments don't. And so if he's trying to really include Native American traditions, I think he's lacking a lot. I think the books by Peter Nabokov definitely did a much better job of telling Indian traditions, and especially Forest in Time did a better job of incorporating them. I think Deloria really needs a lot more Indian traditions in his book to make it more valid, if that's what he's trying to do. Otherwise, he's incorrectly dismissing scientific arguments based on silly sarcasm, and he's not providing any evidence that's scientific, and he's not providing any evidence that's Native American history, so I don't see how his arguments are valid here. Again, another argument that he presents multiple times without any Native American backing or real scientific backing. On page 88, he says, "Moreover, animals do not, as a rule, transmit diseases across species boundaries." Really? Well, the Black Death first comes to mind. Then we have AIDS. Apparently that came from primates of some kind. Swine flu, assuming that came from swine. Bird flu, assuming that came from birds. I'm pretty sure my cat can get my dog sick, and my dog can get my cat sick when they're sick. Yeah, weird how actually diseases do transmit across species lines. Again, doesn't provide any Native American history to back up that claim. Doesn't provide any scientific analysis for that. Nope, just makes that statement. Another reason I think Deloria is wrong. One of these theories he uses in here, he's talking about the Lemuria tar pits in chapter 6. And on page 123 to 124, he says, "The number of carnivores in comparison with herbivores found at Lemuria shows an overwhelming number of carnivores. To follow the orthodox rendering of the story, we should minimally have one herbivore for each carnivore, so that the scenario, frightened cries of trapped deer, invited a minimum of one carnivore for supper, could be maintained." Because only one carnivore will come after a trapped prey. You can have a deer or a mammoth trapped in a tar pit, probably sinking pretty slow, or just plain trapped there. They're crying out. One carnivore comes and tries to attack it, then that one gets stuck, and another carnivore comes and tries to attack it too. They can eat together, because generally they do eat together. A lot of carnivores hunt in packs. If you did look at Native American traditions, you would probably see that they find carnivores hunting in packs. So, also, he didn't get exact numbers of data about the number of carnivores versus herbivores in the pit. He kind of made guesses and estimations. Since this is supposed to be so much about his using native oral traditions to disprove science, I looked through, and I feel like this happens a lot where he doesn't actually use Native American oral traditions in it. And in chapter 5, the mythical Pleistocene hitman, he doesn't use any Indian oral history to back up anything he says. And if this is supposed to be about using Native American oral history, he really doesn't do a good job incorporating it when he goes on and on about other scientific things. And so I really wish he had used more Native American oral tradition so I would have something to talk about in this blog that I'm supposed to be talking about. The next one that I want to talk about, it's on page 31, and he actually uses in Native American oral tradition, and it's talking, he says, there's likewise a kind of bear, much larger than the common bear, which with much hair on the legs, but little on the bodies, which appear quite smooth. And it goes on describing the bear. And then he says afterwards, perhaps it was the description of the upper body devoid of hair that convinced some scholars that the Indians really meant a mammoth or mastodon, but the Indians knew wild animals considerably better than non-Indians and would have recognized a bear when they saw one. I think he kind of makes a leap there, saying that they would know a bear when they see one. And I think especially getting passed down in oral tradition, maybe they didn't have a better word to describe it, or they thought that the bears looked the same. Maybe being passed down the way they described it, they were like, oh yeah, that's a bear. I think it's really unfair that he thinks that Indians, oh yeah, definitely know a bear. But if bears hadn't even, maybe a bear hadn't even evolved yet, and they saw this creature, and then later on they saw a bear, and that's what they called a bear because it was big and hairy and sort of like the other thing. And there's not really a good way to know that, so I think he kind of jumps a lot in that inference, and that's not really fair. Another thing from chapter 6, on page 135, he's using a quote from Ludwell Johnson, I think, citing things about animals and things about Martin Smith, and he says, while giving incidental vocabulary, Puyallup informant named one too many members of the local cat family, cougar, panther, mountain lion, and a fourth lion. And Deloria goes on to say that there was another type of cat, and the Indian tradition proved this. I mean, I guess that's a good job of using Native American tradition to prove that there was another species of cat. But he seems to act like that's some new big information that's being rejected. We know about saber-toothed cats, and we agree that there were some there, and maybe he's trying to justify Native American oral tradition by saying, look, they're right, there was another cat, and we know there was another cat, so let's take them seriously. And if that's what he was trying to do, then, I mean, it's true. I feel he tries so hard to discredit science, but then in this case he's also using it to prove that Native American oral tradition is correct, because they know about the other cat in the cat family. So he uses the oral tradition there, and he's getting into the Indian stuff more, but he doesn't use it to discredit science, which is his overall point, really, and he doesn't really provide any new information, I don't think. Okay, this is just another little problem I had with the way Deloria was writing and his argument, the way he formed his arguments. On 138, he says, could they have been lying on or near the surface for that period of time and not have disintegrated long ago? He's talking about bones here. We should conclude, based on common sense, that the bones were reasonably fresh in the 1760s. He doesn't provide anything scientific that would say these are from the 1760s. I don't know where he got that number from. I don't know why he's finding science wrong here. I don't even feel like in the context he's using it that really proves anything about the Native Americans being right, because they had their stories about them. But I think it's more likely that the stories were passed on for a longer time. Like, I think the stories about mammoths are much older, and mammoths didn't just survive much longer than we think they did. I mean, it's entirely possible, but I would be more likely to believe the Indians passed the oral tradition down for longer. And so his complete use of non-scientific information makes me believe him less. So I think he has really faulty arguments there. Another thing Deloria talks a lot about is the height of Indians and how people used to be larger, which I don't know if they knew this in 1997 or whenever this was copyrighted, but I mean, we do have proof that there were larger species of humanoids. And for one thing, I'm not sure if he knew this, but Neanderthals were a completely different species from Homo sapiens and Cro-Magnon. They did not evolve into each other. Homo sapiens are relatives, but they branched off and were not descended from Neanderthals. But there were species of humanoids that were very large and tall. I think they have some not very intelligent name like Homo gigantus or something. I could be wrong, but I do remember learning about them. I mean, we have really tiny humanoid creatures and we have really big humanoid creatures. And so, but throughout history, there could have and most likely were different Homo sapien or just Homo species running around there that they could remember, and so that's completely likely. And he does back that up with a Native American oral tradition, and on page 139 he says, "From talking with elders of several tribes, my understanding is that the Indians were and are describing people of more than average height. In fact, some elders, as routine matter, have reported that the Indians themselves were much larger and taller." I'm not sure if the Indians themselves really were larger and taller, but I do know, I think we even read in some of the reports that there were massive amounts of Indians in the Americas, and then there were different diseases and things like that, that wars would have killed them off, and their population fluctuated different periods of time. So I think it's likely that the height of Indians could change, and scientifically it's very probable that humans were alive during times when there were giant species of humans. So I think it's likely that they did observe other species, and it's even probable that they carried that on through traditions and oral traditions. I don't think there's really any proof of that, but it's a great way to advance knowledge and have a secondary or primary source for knowledge like that. But then where he doesn't get me is he goes on talking about how the Indians used to be much taller and people were taller in general, as if this was some sort of evolution of people that could happen again. And on page 157 he says, "Today boys in high school are frequently over 7 feet, and in junior high are now seeing some people 6.5 feet tall." I don't know where he's from, but I have not been seeing many 7-foot tall people. I feel like this should be in the news. All these 7-foot high schoolers running around. It's a little bit scary for someone like me who's 5 feet tall. And then he goes on and talks about CO2, and that it's because there's more carbon dioxide, and it's because of global warming that we're having more, when science is more likely to credit like larger species like the dinosaurs with increased percentage of oxygen. Or science talks about nutrition being the difference between like Napoleon being short and people this day being so much taller because we have better nutrition than they did. But this whole CO2 thing just does not make any sense to me. And I think he could have gone a very different way with using the Indian oral tradition. Like maybe talking about their diets, and maybe their diets used to be better, and that's why they were bigger if he wanted to use nutrition. But I think he just goes the wrong way a lot of the time because he doesn't have the scientific knowledge to back up his claims. So that's a really good example of how he uses Indian oral tradition and then just can't really back up his arguments well at all. One part of Deloria's book that I thought was interesting was when he was comparing things to Homer and the Iliad and things like that. And on page 143 he says, scholarly journals are littered with similar kinds of situations in which Indian accounts are rejected simply because they are Indian, and theories are discredited because scholars are not willing to give credence to Indian accounts that seem to be accurate memories of times past. Then he goes on to say that these comments could have been equally applicable to Greek stories such as the Iliad. And they are. But the Iliad was also written down. And while the Native Americans have a fantastic talent for oral history and reciting things orally and carrying on traditions like that, when it comes to hundreds and thousands of years, something's going to be lost, especially when it's going to get lost in translation too, because languages change over time, and especially you're turning it into English on top of that, something's going to get lost in translation. I mean, the Iliad was written down. You write it down and you can copy it word for word, and we can look at the exact first word account of that. But for Indians, you don't know if those words change a lot of the time. I think even Peter Nabokov talked about sometimes they change the story a little bit based on who they're telling it to, what situation it's in, if they're doing it like before war is coming, if it's just like a festival, they change the story a little bit. And I think it might even change like based on the family member who's telling it, where they got the story from, things like that. Well, I do think Indian stories are really good for maybe even pointing science in a good direction of where they should think about looking for maybe geological markers or things like that, and they're a good indicator of what could have happened in the past. I think science is still necessary to back up Indian tradition, and they should use it, and they should be more willing to go out and investigate the theories and ideas of Indians. As much respect as I have for Indian tradition, I'm not as positive as I am when I can see something with my own eyes. Chapter 8 was really my favorite chapter because I think he did use Native American oral tradition so much better than any other part of his book, and really after chapter 8 he does a better job. He tells a lot of Indian stories and how they go along with the scientific proof that we have, like geological matters. I'm not sure exactly what he was trying to do, but to me he really was proving that Indians were telling the correct stories because science has proved that too. The one flaw that I didn't like in chapter 8 was, this is a quote he's using from Philip King on page 166. It says, "All the evidence seems to point to the astonishing conclusion that the Grand Canyon was cut largely in the 2 million years or so of the Pleistocene in later time, or a time when men were living already on the earth. If primitive man had been living in North America, he would have witnessed the formation of the Grand Canyon." For my understanding, the Grand Canyon was made slowly. They witnessed the Grand Canyon, but I don't think that would be part of oral tradition because it was such a gradual change, and I think Indians really remember more drastic changes better. So that's what I didn't really like in chapter 8, even though that's my favorite chapter. Another thing that I really like in chapter 8, to be more specific, I think he really does this in like Bridge of the Gods, or maybe it's Mount Hood, I'm not sure. But he tells the Indian tradition and about how the science has shown that they're right and that really did happen, sort of. And I think one of them talks about a mountain moving, and I thought that was really interesting because then he goes on and talks about how scientifically we can explain that because maybe the river went to one side or the other. And I think that was a really good part because it used science to really prove a Native American oral tradition. And I think that's really what should happen between science and Native American oral tradition, is using science to prove it, and Native Americans maybe directing the way science goes to look about things. And while that's not literally what happened, like a mountain didn't literally move. I think it's great that we can put into words what did happen scientifically and why this was such a big event and prove that this really did happen for the Native Americans. Before I started this video, I looked online and I looked up Deloria and some of his credentials and what kind of academic credentials he had, and I saw that he had a bachelor's in general science, and then he had more history stuff, and he got a law degree in political things, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I watched his interview. He definitely is more knowledgeable about politics. I will give him that. He knows a lot about the government history and things like that. But my biggest problem with Red Earth, White Lies were the scientific flaws. And maybe it's because I was raised on these and I know them so much better. But I don't think he really gave me any solid evidence that proved the scientific theories wrong. He did use Native American oral tradition, but I don't think any of the oral tradition he used disproved the scientific information. Everything he used to disprove these other theories, he just pulls out of thin air and then uses Native American oral tradition that goes along with science, which those parts were fantastic. But I think his attack on present day academia and science was really a waste of time. And I know that I'm supposed to mainly be talking about the Native American oral traditions and his arguments based on that, but it's hard because I don't think he uses Native American oral tradition as much as I would like him to. I think definitely Peter Nabokov, if I'm saying that right, did a much better job using Indian oral tradition, and I think Vine Deloria could have written a much better book if he had included more oral tradition and not gone on so many rants about science instead. I think his time could have been better spent doing that. He's so much better, like in the interview we watched, he's so much better at politics and he's so much knowledgeable about that I think he's really going out on a limb with the science stuff and he doesn't fully understand these theories, so he can't fully discredit them. It's not 1997 anymore, and we know more scientifically now than we did back then, so I feel like it's a little unfair with some of the things I get angry about. I read his preface and or preface and introduction, and I didn't like how he says, oh, everyone's agreeing with me now. If you only look at the facts, you'll see it's correct. I don't have a very nice word for what that makes him. But I think science changes gradually when things are right and not when people complain about them. And I think he got really frustrated with science without doing enough research. I think if you want to prove something wrong, you have to go study it and research it. And the people who can change the way we view history scientifically are the people who actually go and do the work and not just read and look for flaws. And that's the entire video. And I know it's not as fun and doesn't have as many or any pictures and sounds like the other one did. I just didn't really have a lot of gaps to be creative because it was so about the book. I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's something on YouTube called Drunk History, and I thought it'd be really funny if there was a Native American drunk history, and I looked for it. I couldn't find it, so maybe I'll have to make that one of these days. Maybe I'll attach it to my final if I have time after writing the final. But I have a lot of opinions on Vine Deloria, but I hope I stayed on topic enough. And I hope you enjoyed watching. This one was a little easier to make because I knew how to do all the editing now that I had all that practice before. And it's definitely longer because I had more material to talk about with this book and more opinions, I think. But I hope it was still a good way to really express myself. So I hope that you made it to the end and enjoyed watching. Okay, thank you.